at this hour. They'll be gabbling back in at 2:15 Eastern for more work on a veterans jobs bill, providing trading and veterans preferences in certain federal jobs. A procedural vote on that is set to take place shortly after lawmakers return. The House is holding a procedural vote on FISA reauthorization and a land exchange bill. You can see the House live on our companion network C-SPAN. And now live to the Senate floor.
Way closed. The debate on the motion to proceed to calendar number 476, S3457, a bill to require the Secretary of Veterans Affairs to establish a Veterans Job Corps and for other purposes, signed by 17 senators.
By unanimous consent, the mandatory quorum call has been waived. The question is it the sense of the Senate that debate on the motion to proceed to S3457, a bill to require the Secretary of Veterans Affairs to establish a Veterans Job Corps and for other purposes, shall be brought to a close? The yeas and nays are mandatory under the rule. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka, Mr. Alexander, Ms. Ayotte, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Baucus, Mr. Bekich, Mr. Bennett, Mr. Bingaman, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Bozeman, Mrs. Boxer, Mr. Brown in Massachusetts. Mr. Brown of Ohio, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Chambliss, Mr. Coates, Mr. Coburn, Mr. Cochran, Ms. Collins, Mr. Conrad, Mr. Coons, Mr. Corker, Mr. Cornyn, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Dement, Mr. Durbin, Mr. Enzi, Mrs. Feinstein, Mr. Franken, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mrs. Hagan, Mr. Harkin, Mr. Hatch, Mr. Heller, Mr. Hoeven, Mrs. Hutchison, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Inouye, Mr. Isaacson, Mr. Johans, Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin, Mr. Johnson of South Dakota, Mr. Kerry, Mr. Kirk, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Cole, Mr. Kyle, Ms. Landrieu, Mr. Lautenberg, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Levin, Mr. Lieberman, Mr. Lugar, Mr. Manchin, Mr. McCain, Mrs. McCaskill, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Ms. Mikulski, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Nelson of Nebraska, Mr. Nelson of Florida, Mr. Paul, Mr. Portman, Mr. Pryor, Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, Mr. Reed of Nevada, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Rockefeller, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schumer. Mr. Sessions. Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Snow, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall of Colorado, Mr. Udall of New Mexico, Mr. Vitter, Mr. Warner, Mr. Webb, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden. Senators voting in the affirmative: Bingaman, Brown in Massachusetts, Brown of Ohio, Chambliss, Conrad, Corker, Crapo, Grassley, Menendez, Mikulski, Sanders, Shaheen, and Webb. No senator voted in the negative. Mr. Burr, aye. Mrs. Hagan, aye. Mr. Reid of Rhode Island, aye. Mr. Udall of New Mexico, aye. Mr. Cole, aye. Mr. Coburn, aye. Mr. Blumenthal, aye. Mr. Roberts. Mr. Roberts, aye. Mr. Beckidge, aye. Mr. Franken, aye. Mr. Vitter, aye. Mr. Cochran, aye. Mr. Akaka, aye. Mr. McCain, aye. Mr. Bennett, aye. Sluger. Mr. Lugar, aye. Mr. Wyden. Aye. Mr. Wyden, aye. Mrs. Boxer, aye. Mr. Graham, aye. Mr. Heller, aye. Mr. Coons. Mr. Coons, aye. Mr. Nelson. Mr. Nelson of Florida, aye. Mr. Hatch. Mr. Hatch, aye. Ms. Stabenow, aye. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin, aye. Mr. Cardin, aye. Mr. Toomey. Mr. Toomey, aye. Mr. Lee. Mr. Lee, aye. Mr. Paul, no. Mr. Sessions, aye. Ms. Landrieu, aye. Ms. Collins. Ms. Collins, aye. Mr. Rockefeller, aye. Mr. Carey, aye. Mr. Tester, aye. Mr. Isaacson. Mr. Isaacson, aye. Mr. Balkus, aye. Mr. Enzi, aye. Mrs. Feinstein, aye. Mr. Udall. Mr. Udall of Colorado, aye. Mr. Harkin. Mr. Harkin, aye. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Barrasso, aye. Mr. Thune, aye. Mr. Nelson, Nebraska, aye. Mr. Carper, aye. Mr. Wicker, aye. Mr. Kyle, aye. Ms. Ayotte, aye. Mr. Pryor, aye. Mr. Leahy, aye. Mr. Lieberman, aye. Mr. Inouye, aye. Mr. Portman, aye. Mr. Johans, aye. Mr. Inhofe? No. Mr. Inhofe, aye. Mr. Durbin? Mr. Durbin, aye. Mr. Manchin? Aye. Mrs. Gillibrand? Aye. Ms. Snow? Aye. Mr. Merkley? Aye. Ms. Cantwell? Ms. Cantwell? Aye. Mrs. Murray? Aye. Ms. Klobuchar? Aye. Mrs. McCaskill? Mrs. McCaskill? Aye. Mr. Shelby? Aye. Mr. Levin? Mr. Levin? Aye. Mr. Casey? Aye. Mr. Bozeman? Aye. Mrs. Hutchison? Aye. Mr. Risch? Aye. Mr. Cornyn? Aye. Mr. McConnell? Aye. Mr. Reed of Nevada? Aye. Ms. Murkowski? Aye. Mr. Alexander? Aye. Mr. Blunt? Aye. Yes. Mr. Schumer? Mr. Schumer? Aye. Mr. Hoven, aye. Mr. Whitehouse, aye. Mr. Coates, aye. Mr. Moran, aye. Mr. Dement, aye. Mr. Lautenberg, aye.
Okay. On this vote, the yeas are 95, the nays are 1. 3/5 of the senators duly chosen and sworn having voted in the affirmative, the motion is agreed to. Senator from New York. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka? Mr. Alexander.
Waiting for further debate on the Senate floor this afternoon, senators returned from their weekly party caucus lunches a short time ago and voted to move forward with work on the Veterans Jobs Bill, providing training and veterans preference in certain federal jobs. The vote on that was 95-1. We are also expecting further remarks on the floor on the 11th anniversary of 9/11 today. Our coverage has included the President and First Lady taking part in a moment of silence at the White House earlier today. We also watched as the President placed a wreath and made comments during a Pentagon ceremony. New York City had a reading of the names of the victims of 9/11. All this is available on our website. You can see it at cspan.org. While we wait for the Senate to continue debate, comments from Republican presidential candidate Mitt Romney. He spoke just a short time ago at the annual National Guard Association convention in Reno, Nevada.
Thank you so much, please. Thank you. Major General Valvola, thank you for your generous introduction, and thank you for your years of service as Chairman of the Board and for your decades of service to our nation. Ladies and gentlemen of the National Guard Association, it's an honor to be with you on this day of memorial and of appreciation. We remember with heavy hearts the tragic loss of life, and we express thankfulness for the men and women who responded to that tragedy. We honor them, and we honor those who secure our safety even to this day. We honor the men and women of the National Guard. For 375 years, whenever your countrymen have encountered threat and danger, you have willingly gone. Wherever the cause of freedom has called, you have answered. And as the threats to liberty have emanated from distant lands, you've served far from home and far from family. The nation has asked much of you, much more than had been expected, but you never faltered, never wavered from your mission, from that motto, always ready, always there. Several weeks ago, I saw the Guard in action in Louisiana after it was hit by Hurricane Isaac. For many people of the Gulf who had just finished repairing their homes and getting life back to normal after Katrina, the damage from Isaac felt like too much to bear. As I toured the flooded streets, I was not surprised to find the Guard keeping order, distributing water and supplies, and caring for many of those who had been evacuated and rescued. Time and again, it has been the Guardsman's hand that has lifted a child from rising waters, that has rescued a family from a hurricane's fury, and that has fed and clothed a fellow American whose home and possessions have been lost to nature's devastation. It's a Guardsman who took out Saddam Hussein's tanks from his A-10 and who fought to secure the villages of Afghanistan. Thank you for that service. As you know too well, our world is a dangerous place, and the attack on our homeland and citizens on September 11th, 2001, reminds us that the mission of the Guard is ever more critical and ever more deserving of our support and honor. More than a decade has now passed since that day of tragedy, but the visions and the events are seared in the memory of every American. We remember those who died. We marvel at the courage of those who stormed the cockpit when they became aware of the malevolent purpose of the hijackers. We hold up in prayer the families and friends who've lived in a shadow cast by grief. We draw strength from the selflessness of the first responders, and we renew our resolve to protect America from the designs of evil men. Like you, I remember where I was on September 11th. I was originally planning to be in Battery Park in New York City, not far from the World Trade Center itself. But as it turned out, I was in Washington, D.C. to meet with members of Congress about preparations for the security of the upcoming Olympic Winter Games. A colleague and I were working in the office we had in the Ronald Reagan building. It was just a few blocks from the White House. Someone rushed into our office and said that a plane had hit the World Trade Center. I turned on the small TV on our desk there and watched in shock as the flames and smoke erupted from the North Tower. I called my wife, Ann. She, too, watched the tragedy from her TV and wondered how a plane could fly into a building in clear daylight. And then we saw the second plane crash into the second tower. These then were purposeful attacks. These were terrorist attacks. These were evil and cowardly and heinous attacks. Leaving the city, I drove towards Alexandria. The highway I was on came within a few hundred yards of the Pentagon, which had been hit by then. Cars were stopped where they were, and people had gotten out, watching in horror. I could smell burning fuel and concrete and steel. It was a smell of war, something I never imagined I would smell in America. In our own ways, we each were overwhelmed by the enormity of the loss of life. We struggled to comprehend the magnitude of what this meant for the families of those who had been killed, and for our own families, for our nation, for the world. For some, there was also anger, but grief and anger soon turned to action. And among those taking the lead were members of the National Guard. Members of the Guard secured our airports and borders, and members of the Guard began to mobilize to deploy half a world away, where you had become all too familiar with the mountains of the Hindu Kush and the streets of Fallujah. Throughout the last 11 years, Guardsmen and women have helped keep us safe from attack, and the nation owes you a great debt of gratitude. I wish I could say the world is less dangerous now, that it's less chaotic. I wish I could predict with certainty the threats we'll face in the years ahead. But on September 10th, 2001, we had no idea that America would be at war in Afghanistan someday. In December of 2010, we had no idea that a Tunisian street vendor would inspire a revolution that would topple 3 dictators. We live in a time of turbulence and disruption. What I can say with certainty is that we need the National Guard's vigilance and strength now as much as ever before. With less than 2 months to go before Election Day, I would normally speak to a gathering like this about the differences between my and my opponent's plans for military and for our national security. There is a time and place for that, but this day is not that. It is instead a day to express gratitude to the men and women who fought and who are still fighting to protect us and our country, including those who traced the trail of terror to that walled compound in Abbottabad, and the SEALs who delivered justice to Osama bin Laden. This is also a day in which all of us in this convention hall and in this campaign and in this country can hopefully agree on important things.
Mr. President, there has been, appropriately enough, a lot of discussion about our $16 trillion national debt and our $1 trillion federal deficit. And this is, in fact, an enormously important issue, and it is an issue that the Congress must address. But it must address this crisis in a way that is fair to the middle class and the working families and our seniors and our kids. It is an issue that must be addressed, but it must be addressed fairly. Mr. President, when we talk about the deficit and the national debt, it is important to remember how we got to where we are today. And we can simply go back 10 years or so to January of 2001, when President Clinton left office and President Bush assumed the presidency. And at that particular moment in history, in January 2001, I hope everybody remembers that not only did this country have a $236 billion surplus, all of the projections for the future at that point was that surplus was going to grow and grow and grow. And in fact, at that point, one of the great debates taking place in Congress is, what do we do with all of that money? How much do you give back in tax breaks? How much do you put into Social Security? That was the debate in January 2001. So before we discuss how we go forward in deficit reduction today with a $1 trillion deficit, it's important to remember that, and it's important to remember how we got to where we are today. And how we got to where we are today really, in a significant way, is not complicated. President Bush assumed office, and within a few years we were fighting not just one war in Afghanistan, but another war in Iraq. And I hope that the American people appreciate that many of the deficit hawks today, the people who tell us, oh, gee, we've got to cut Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid and nutrition and education, we got to cut, 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 cut. When asked to pay for those wars, they had nothing to say. Paul Ryan, Mr. Romney's vice presidential nominee, chairman of the House Budget Committee, voted for the wars but forgot to pay for them. Nobody knows exactly how much these two wars will end up costing, but the guess is that by the time we take care of the last veteran 70 years from now, those wars may run up over $3 trillion, and we did not pay for them to the tune of 1 penny. All put on the credit card, all added to the deficit. And, Mr. President, I find it somewhat unusual that many of our Republican deficit hawks who stand up here on the floor of the Senate every day and tell us how deeply concerned they are about the deficit, well, they all voted for huge tax breaks for millionaires and billionaires to the tune of $1 trillion over a 10-year period. Well, you don't give huge tax breaks to the rich and not offset it if you are serious about the deficit and not being hypocritical. And many of my Republican friends during the Bush years voted for the insurance company-written Medicare Part D prescription drug program, written by the insurance companies and the drug companies, going to cost us about $400 billion over a 10-year period. Mr. President, how did we pay for that program? Oh, I guess we didn't pay for it at all. Our deficit hawk friends voted for that program, which was good politics, I guess. They forgot to pay for it. Add another $400 billion to the deficit. And, Mr. President, it is important to understand that today, in the midst of this horrendous recession, the issue is not just cuts, cuts, cuts. The issue is that right now, today, at 15.2% revenue as a percentage of gross domestic product, it is lower than any time in the last 60 years because we deregulated Wall Street. Republicans wanted that. Some Democrats wanted that. We allowed investor banks to merge with commercial banks, to merge with insurance companies. And as a result of the illegal behavior on Wall Street, we were driven into this recession, mass unemployment, businesses go under, less tax revenue comes in, and at 15.2%, revenue today as a percentage of GDP is the lowest that it has been in 60 years. So, Mr. President, those are some of the reasons that today we are experiencing a $1 trillion deficit and a $16 trillion national debt. Now, my Republican friends will say, well, you know, Bernie, be that as it may, yeah, maybe we should have paid for the wars. Maybe we shouldn't have given tax breaks to billionaires when the rich are doing very, very well. Maybe we should have paid for the Medicare Part D. Maybe we should not have deregulated Wall Street. But be that as it may, that's water over the dam. We are where we are right now, and we have got to go forward on deficit reduction. So what are their ideas, Mr. President? Well, Mitt Romney has not been as clear as I think he should be about his ideas, but we do have a blueprint from our Republican friends from the Ryan budget. And as you know, Congressman Ryan, as chairman of the Budget Committee, presented a budget. It was passed by the Republican House. And here is some of what the Republican budget is about. What the Republicans want to do is to make cuts to Social Security and to raise the retirement age. And I want to say a word about Social Security right now, because it's an issue I feel very, very strongly about. Mr. President, I think a lot of Americans don't know this. Social Security, because it is funded by the payroll tax and not the general treasury, has not contributed one nickel to our deficit. Social Security today has a $2.7 trillion surplus and can pay out all benefits owed to all eligible Americans for the next 21 years. In my view, it would be wrong, it would be deeply wrong to consider cuts in Social Security as part of deficit reduction because Social Security hasn't contributed a nickel to the deficit. But our Republican friends support cuts in Social Security, and many of them, over a period of years, want to move toward the privatization of Social Security. Mr. President, the Ryan budget would end Medicare as we know it in a 10-year period. Now, what does that mean? What that means is that if in 10 years you are 70 years of age, you would be given a voucher for $8,000, as I understand the number. And let's just assume that an individual walks into a 70-year-old individual, 75-year-old individual, walks into a doctor's office, and the doctor says, Joe, Mary, I'm really sorry to tell you, but you're dealing with cancer. We're going to have to send you to the hospital. There are a whole number of treatments that you're going to have to undertake. And those treatments are going to cost you tens and tens of thousands of dollars, if not more. And that individual then goes to his or her insurance company and says, I have $8,000 to buy an insurance policy. Mr. President, what do you think that insurance agent is going to tell that individual when that person is facing tens and tens of thousands of dollars of medical bills? That insurance company's function is to make money. That's what its function is. And they're not going to say, oh, sure, thanks, give us the $8,000 so we can spend $50,000 on health care costs for you. It ain't going to happen. And that insurance company is going to say, hey, there's the door, try somebody else. And that's going to happen to a whole lot of people. And you can think of what the end of that story is. And the end of the story is if that family, that individual does not have any money, he or she is going to go to his kids. And if they don't have any money, the outcome is not going to be good because that person simply will not have the treatment that he or she needs. Mr. President, the Ryan budget proposes to cut $770 billion over a 10-year period for Medicaid. And that would result in at least 14 million Americans losing their health insurance and would also cut nursing home assistance in half, threatening the long-term care of some 10 million senior citizens. Now, many people don't know that. Many people say, well, you know, Medicaid is for the poor. And it is certainly true that millions of low-income kids, deservedly, through the Children's Health Insurance Program, get their health insurance with significant help from Medicaid and state money. But what people don't understand is that Medicaid is also a major contributor toward nursing home care. And I want the average middle-class family to understand that if their mom or their pop develops Alzheimer's or some other very difficult situation, can't stay at home, can't stay with their kids, has to be put in a nursing home, which is pretty expensive. Understand that all over this country, Medicaid is putting money into making sure that elderly people can stay in nursing homes with some degree of dignity. But it's not just Social Security or Medicare and Medicaid that our Republican friends are going after. In my state of Vermont, and Mr. President, I'm sure in Minnesota, we have lower-income, working-class kids who no longer can go to college because college is too expensive. We have other young people who are graduating college, $25,000, $50,000 in debt, unable to find jobs which help them pay off that debt. In my view, the Pell Grant program, which is the major way in Washington we help low and moderate income kids, I think that is too low. Too low. We're not helping enough kids with enough resources. But the Ryan budget would slash college Pell Grants by about 60% next year alone. So if you are a parent or you're a young person in college, that is how they intend to balance the budget. Mr. President, in the midst of this horrendous recession, older people, lower-income people are struggling, and it's very easy to forget about it here in the confines of the U.S. Senate, but there are millions of Americans today wondering how they're going to feed their kids tonight, who open the refrigerator and there's no food in that refrigerator, who depend upon food stamps. Half of the food stamp money goes to the elderly and goes to the children, but they want to make devastating cuts in food stamps. So, Mr. President, my main point is pretty simple. The deficit is a serious issue, and we have got to address it. But it would not only be immoral, it would be bad economic policy to move toward deficit reduction, to move toward a balanced budget on the backs of millions and millions of seniors and children and working families who today, as a result of this terrible recession, are already struggling to keep their heads above water. You don't balance the budget on the backs of the most vulnerable people in this country. That is bad economic policy. That is immoral. There are ways to move forward which can achieve the same goals, but without hurting people who are already in pain. Now, Mr. President, what we don't talk about too much in Congress is who is winning and who is losing in the current American economy. So I just want to bring forth a few facts that I think the American people and my colleagues should be familiar with. And that is, number one, in America today we have the most unequal distribution of wealth and income of any major country on earth, and worse in America today than any time since the 1920s. We have in America today, and people should check it out, they may not believe me when I say this, you got one family, the Walton family of Walmart fame. One family owns more wealth than the bottom 40% of the American people. One family owns more wealth than the bottom 40%, and our Republican friends say that's not enough. We have to give those people, billionaires, even more tax breaks. Today, the top 1%, Mr. President, owns about 41% of the wealth of America. The bottom 60%, that is a significant majority of the American people added all together, own about 2.3% of the wealth of America. Top 1%, 41%, bottom 60%, 2.3%. Now, common sense and decency would suggest that when a few people have incredible wealth, when a few people are seeing their income and their wealth grow rapidly, while the middle class is shrinking and poverty is increasing, common sense and common decency suggest that you ask the people on top, whose effective tax rate is the lowest in decades, to start paying their fair share of taxes before you cut Social Security, before you cut Medicare, Medicaid, education, and nutrition programs. Mr. President, right now, about 1 out of 4 major profitable corporations is paying zero in taxes. We have had instances which I have portrayed here on the floor of the Senate of some of the most profitable corporations in America in a given year paying nothing in federal income tax and, in fact, getting a rebate from the IRS. Well, before you tell the elderly and the children that they have got to experience cuts when they can't afford it, maybe you say to corporate America, sorry, we are going to end the loopholes that you currently are enjoying. Mr. President, every single year we are losing about $100 billion in tax revenue because corporations and wealthy individuals are stashing their money in tax havens in the Cayman Islands, Bermuda, and elsewhere. These quote-unquote patriotic Americans